Welcome to the Big Money Questions Show. I'm Rachel Rickard-Strauss, Personal Finance Editor for This Is Money. Today we're going to talk about growth. It's good, right? Growth has to be good. We talk about economic growth all the time and its importance, and how important it is that it's strengthening, that it's higher than other countries. But just thought we'd check in, make sure that it is always good. We are lucky enough to have Kate Raworth with us to talk us through it. She is the author of a new book, Doughnut Economics. It's brilliant. I would say that because she's here, but it is honestly visionary. And she also teaches at Oxford University and calls herself a renegade economist. So Kate, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let's just kick off with the stinker. Growth. Is it good?
It's a great question, a very big question. If we're jumping in with the economy, economic growth, we hear every day in the media, the economy is growing, it's back growing, the economy's health is rising. So it's talked of as if it's always good and always that's good enough. If the economy's growing, that's all we need to be happening. But if we just pull back into our own lives and think about the word growth, it's a very powerful word. When our children are born, we want to see them grow. We want personal growth in our lives. We want our love to grow, our friendships to grow, our gardens to grow. So the idea of growth is at the heart of what we think of as progress. So it's very easy to assume that, well, if the economy's growing, everything's fine and rosy, right? That's enough. But think again about your children. I've got 8-year-old twins, and at the moment they're growing incredibly fast. They need new shoes twice a year. It's very expensive. Thank goodness one day their feet will stop growing. Otherwise, they'd no longer be able to sit at my kitchen table. Think of our bodies. We grow to a certain height, but then we stop. In fact, in our bodies, what we want is balance. And if there's something inside our bodies growing too much, well, that's a cancer. So actually, when we think twice about growth, there are times in life where growth is fantastic. It's a healthy phase of progress. Mm-hmm. But most things in nature, from your children's feet to the Amazon forest, actually grow and then they mature and thrive. So there's space for us to think about what's an economy when it's thriving. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always growing. I know that's a really controversial thing to say because the whole of the last century of economics has been based on this idea that growth is the goal. I want to question that because I think we're moving into an era where we need a new goal and it's thriving.
So what are the flaws of growth that we might be better to sort of divert our attention more to thriving rather than to growth?
So growth in economics means an increase in GDP, the gross domestic product of a country, and that means the actual value of goods and services sold in, say, a year in the country. Now, at first glance, it might seem that if the value of goods and services has gone up, well, that can only be a good thing. But you have to ask a lot of questions. First of all, what's being bought and sold? Was it the forest that we actually depended upon for capturing rainwater, sequestering carbon, for going for walks at the weekend? If we chopped down a forest, turned it into wood and sold it off, that's not a very smart way to increase GDP. If GDP increased because somebody invented a brilliant new design and people want it, well, that's a good reason. So there are really good reasons for GDP to go up and down. My favorite analogy is if someone says, imagine if the police came and knocked on your door and said, we just want you to know there's an increase of activity in your area. You'd really want to know what kind of activity that was. I mean, do you mean kids having fun in the street or do you mean crime? So just a measure of value of things being sold isn't enough to tell us. So what's being sold to increase GDP and what's being lost at the time? Are we losing our natural wealth or our community wealth in the process? And who's getting the value of this increase in GDP? In recent years, around 90% of the increase in GDP in the UK and the US has gone to the richest 10 or 1% of people in the country. So the growth, the value of that is being captured by people who already have the most. Is that enough? Surely it's not enough. Again, we need to think more broadly. When an economy is growing, what's it growing out of? What's being lost? Who's gaining for that? And how long does this growth need to go on for? How long can it go on for? Perhaps it'll start to damage the living world on which we fundamentally depend. So we need a much richer idea of what economic progress looks like than just merely saying GDP is going up.
The way you talk about it sounds like a very blunt tool that we use at the moment that hides all sorts of mischief, things that create growth once but never can again because we've used it, we've expended it, we've sold it, whatever we've done. And such inequality underneath that is not captured by that one sacred number, GDP. What then do you think we should do instead?
Right. So that's the tricky question. If you're going to dislodge an old measure and an old symbol that people used to run the economy by, what are you going to replace it with? Well, as you said with the name of my book, I actually want to replace it with a picture of a donut. And I know that sounds absurd. Who would have thought that junk food could be the future for humanity? But actually, if you try and draw a picture of human thriving in the 21st century, it looks a little bit like a donut with a hole in the middle. So in that hole is a place where people are falling short on life's essentials, people who don't have enough food or decent housing or political voice or healthcare, education. And we want to get everybody out of the hole in the middle of the donut. But we don't want to go so far that we actually go beyond the donut's outer crust, because there we're overshooting our pressure on the planet. We're causing climate change or biodiversity loss or acidifying the oceans, undermining the very life support systems that we depend upon for our well-being. So we want to get into a space where everybody has enough, but we're not putting too much pressure on the planet. And to me, the fundamental picture of that isn't growth. Growth looks like this, always going up, 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 ever rising. The new picture of the economy we need to draw is about balance, balancing between meeting the needs of everybody within the means of the planet. And that's what I think of as thriving.
Is there a way to do that that's not just a matter of sort of limiting what people would see as their own freedoms, as their own liberties? At the moment, a lot of it comes down to the markets, what people decide to buy, and we allow them to do it. We have obviously regulations to make sure that things aren't going too berserk. You can't just sort of, burn fossil fuels relentlessly without some kind of regulation from government. But it sounds like to bring us back within your donut, there's all sorts of other sort of impositions that would be necessary. Is there a way of doing it a different way?
Oh, there's so much I want to say in response to that. It's a great question. So first of all, we don't want to limit people's freedoms. We all want to feel free and able to live a life of dignity and opportunity. And the most important thing for doing that is to ensure that everybody has life's essentials. People who don't have decent healthcare do not have opportunity in their lives because their life is hampered by that, or don't have decent housing, or access to good schools for their kids, or access to a good job. So getting everybody out of that space of deprivation, for me, is the most fundamental way we can ensure that everybody is free to lead a life of well-being and opportunity. But yes, we can't allow people to put extreme pressure on the earth system on which we depend. Now, sometimes that's painted as restrictions and limitations, but actually, if we think of it, they're protections. Protections for workers' rights, so that workers aren't exploited by companies that'll make them work for overtime, unpaid overtime at the last minute. It's protection for the living world to ensure that our kids aren't going to school in districts of cities where the air pollution index is so high they're not allowed to play in the playground. So there are protections that need to be put in place to protect our well-being. And the genius of inventors and innovators and smart business people is to run a business that respects that and is ingenious anyway. Think of Mozart. He played the piano. He didn't ask for a bigger and bigger keyboard all the time. He got inventive within the space that he had. Think of Jimi Hendrix. He played incredible solos on the guitar. He didn't ask for more and more strings or more and more frets on the guitar. He got more inventive within that space. So sometimes having a restricted space that protects people's well-being actually brings out the best in entrepreneurs and in innovators, because they see how to innovate in that space. And that's the kind of business that we want to create, I think, in the 21st century, that enables us to thrive within the boundaries of human well-being.
How feasible do you think it is to stay in that space long term if we're rejecting this idea of growth forever? We still have a growing population, another, 3 billion expected in the next...
Over this century.
Yeah. So increasing numbers of people moving into the middle classes who have not had the types of things that we take for granted now, but are going to want them. Is it possible to stay within that donut with the number of people and with their increasing wants, and also with we're seen as consumers. People want stuff. There doesn't seem to be much of a way round. I suppose there is, but you'd have to considerably change people's aspirations and overhaul lifestyles to stay within it. Is it possible?
Well, I think this is the 21st century challenge. This is the question for our generation, this century. You're absolutely right. There are going to be more than 3 billion more people, over 10 billion of us in total this century. Many more people coming into the global middle class, which is people who live on between $10 and $100 a day. And those people, of course, they want electricity, they want to have food in a fridge, they want to feed their families well, they want to travel and go on holidays, they aspire to the lifestyles they see. Can that be done? I believe a lot of it is down to the scale of inequality that exists today. So we need to redistribute use of the world's resources, and the way to do that is through using far smarter technologies for resource use. For example, in many countries, rainwater falls on houses, it disappears off and isn't captured, and then later on in the season they might face shortages of water. If you harvest the rainwater and capture it in barrels, you can provide for the water needs for the fields, for the households. So simple technological innovations mean actually we can be far smarter about working with the resources that Earth gives us to meet all of our needs. But there is the question of, do people want to aspire to today's lifestyle? Interestingly, I think the new generation, even in high-income countries like the UK, younger people don't want to own a car. Many of them say, I don't want to own a car. I want mobility, yes. I want access to a car when I need one. I quite like it to be electric, so I know I'm not polluting the city. I want access to a car. I don't want ownership of a car. So they're more interested in the services than the ownership of these great bulking metal boxes. And that's a really valuable shift in what people want in their lives. 20th century businesses tried to sell us things. Buy a car, buy a washing machine, buy a lawnmower. I think in the 21st century, smart companies realised that actually what people want is mobility. They want clean clothes, they want cut grass. You can sell them those services rather than the machinery. And that's an example of one way that we can meet the needs of everybody within the means of the planet if we transform the way we think about what the economy is and is for.
People also want experiences though as well. That's another sort of move that we see. It's right that people are less interested in stuff, but it seems to be at the same time an increase in desire for experiences, and that's what is being sold to us even through stuff. So travel, things like that. I wonder whether we'll just end up sort of displacing one set of pressures with another.
I think there's a real danger of that, and one of the ironies is that when people hear an area of natural beauty is under threat, well, they want to go there and see it before it's lost. But of course, in the process of rushing there to go and see it, we help bring about its demise. So again, it's going to be a century-long journey, this. The 20th century was the century in which psychologists and marketing experts learned to understand how to market things to people, how to connect a new car with your deeply held value of freedom or status, and to make you believe that if I buy the car, I'll get status. We need to undo all of the propaganda that was built into this idea of consumerism, that the great way to spend Saturday is shopping. Is that really the great way to spend Saturday? Isn't it perhaps with our friends or visiting somewhere, but not necessarily always flying there? So it's a real challenge to do this, and I think there's a new generation of thinkers, whether they're economists or psychologists or lifestyle philosophers, trying to figure out how we can shift what we desire to make it compatible with living well in the 21st century. Because if we keep pursuing those old goals and old values, we will push ourselves into a very dangerous corner of high consumerism and high pressure on the planet on which we depend.
I wonder what individuals can do. Individuals who agree that you can't have growth going on and on and on forever. What do you do within, I suppose, within the sort of current framework that we have, or to change it?
So I think there's a lot individuals can do. Sometimes we're told to think of ourselves merely as consumers, and it's just what you buy. But we're not just consumers or even just producers. We are citizens. We're neighbours, we can be volunteers, we're educators. So there's a lot of different ways that we can start sharing our values. We can transform the way we shop, what we buy, what we eat, how we travel. But we can also transform how we invest our money, how we save for pension, how we divest from fossil fuels, how we protest, what we stand up for as our rights. So I think of the economy as an ever-evolving system. It's continually changing, like a garden, continually growing. And I think that's a very empowering idea, because it means that each one of us, in our behaviours and in our actions, in setting up a company or in choosing how to save for our pension, we're continually reshaping the economy, because we as little actors in it start to build critical mass of a new way of doing things. So I find it an empowering idea to think about, how does the way that I live my life affect our ability to live well? Of course, it goes far beyond the individual, though. It's important not to say it's all about what individuals do. We need to see governments taking responsibility and shaping the economy in a way that enables us all to thrive. We need to see companies taking leadership and committing to being a 21st century company, rather than merely pursuing profit at all costs to the environment and society. So we need leadership from lots of different places, but I think individuals can make a difference.
And just to finally go back to that idea of growth, how important is that notion for creating these sort of underlying changes? Do we have to change GDP, how we talk about growth, how we talk about economic growth? Do we have to resist that narrative or introduce a new one? Or is it just sort of, the way we talk about it is very different to what happens in practice?
So I'm interested really in the long term of the 21st century. I like thinking big and long, because this is an extraordinary century coming to us. Last century's economics and policy making was very dominated by growth, ever since the concept of GDP was first invented in the 1930s. And growth was always seen as the solution. If you've got a trade deficit, then growth will get you out. Unemployment growth will get you out. Budget deficit growth will get you out. Inequality in society growth will solve that. This century, I think we do need a new language, because I think we're too locked into that old mentality. I talk about it as thriving. And the way I like to ask the question is this: we have an economy today that needs to grow, whether or not it makes us thrive. We are actually addicted to growth financially, politically, and socially. What we need is an economy that makes us thrive, whether or not it grows. And we need to think again about the financial system that we have and its drive always for increasing rate of return. We need to think about the political addiction to growth. Every economy wants to stay as big as its neighbours, so it doesn't get pushed out of geopolitical power. And we need to think again about our social addiction to growth, thinking that a better life means having more income. That's not necessarily, for those who have sufficient income, more is not always going to be better. So I think we need to overcome those addictions, create an economy that allows us to thrive, whether or not it grows. And I know that sounds like a radical question, but I think these are the days for asking the radical questions.
Good note to end on. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for the Big Money Questions.